take our hearts and set them on fire for you. Amen. Arguably, what went wrong back then is the reason that you are here today. 2 huge failures made a big difference. The first man was a huge flop at his biggest gig, and it stung. The marketing campaign that had succeeded before failed spectacularly now. He'd always been controversial, but people had at least paid attention, and some had bought into what he said. Now he was supposed to lay low for a while. He'd been run out of one town and chased to a second and furtively secreted away to a third. He was told to wait, just wait until your teammates catch up. But waiting was not in this man's DNA. Maybe he was ADD, maybe he was obsessive compulsive, maybe he was an egotistical son of a gun and thought he could do it alone. Perhaps he was just on fire. Whatever the reason, as he quickly sized up this new market, he grew angry and he completely forgot about laying low. He started haranguing all the folks on the street corners, anywhere he could find a crowd. And you know how effective that is when you're being harangued. The person who raves in about the world coming to an end and your destiny as burning up to a crisp. Today, we tend to adjust our path to avoid that person, and of course, that's what people did back then too. This was Paul, and he was having a hard time in Athens. His usual bag of tricks didn't work. Until now, he could successfully build a case by drawing on Jewish cultural images, quoting Jewish prophets and laws. And as a scholar of all things in the Hebrew texts, his arguments could flow brilliantly from those sources. He could parry back convincingly for both Jews and the devout Gentiles who often attended synagogue too. But Athens needed something different, and Paul was at a loss. You heard it, he was labeled a babbler. Nice. Athens didn't mind new, good ideas. They made public debate a spectator sport, as if witty and thoughtful commentators all were broadcasting live on Boston Common all the time. You'd hear David Brooks and Rachel Maddow and Vox and 538, Hugh Hewitt, maybe some people from the Heritage Foundation, a few from Brookings. In Athens, people actually read the New York Times Sunday Book Review. But Paul couldn't get much traction, and it must have been an ego blow. But it was also a wake-up call because new ideas would be welcome. Railing against the Athenians because they were evil idol worshippers was not the place to start. And luckily, Paul got a second chance. He got a booking at the Areopagus, the place where serious issues could be heard and discussed. How would he approach things in round 2? A second man in another era initially blew his first assignment also. Again, the Jesus movement was on the cusp of failure, though they didn't have any idea. Popes and priests and soldiers were focused on building a Christian empire, slaughtering the Muslims and Jews in the Crusades, building riches and massive buildings sufficient to intimidate any potential rivals. Convert or be killed. I'm powerful, you're weak. I'm right, you're wrong. The same narrow, angry attitude that Paul had flung out at the Athenian idol worshippers. Now, this second man had begun his life journey fitting right in the model of his time. He was a dashing soldier and he made merry with the other rich people. But when the reality of war came and all of its bloodshed, he limped home and found himself without a purpose. Unexpectedly, he sensed the holy of life urging him, rebuild my church. Like most of us, he interpreted the mission narrowly. though it felt to him as if he were stretching to do even that, thinking his job was to put in a few new windows and to mortar up the crumbling walls of a little chapel. He stole funds from his father to buy the building supplies. But like Paul before him, Francis also had to shift gears. Rebuilding the little chapel wasn't enough for St. Francis. What should he do? What both Paul in about 60 AD and Francis of Assisi did 1100 years later was that they got outside. They walked all around. They couldn't stay in the synagogue or the stone chapel or in the accepted ways of religious thinking in their age, built on vitriol against religions other than their own, whether it be Gentile or Muslim. What made a difference, all the difference, is they got out and they walked. Paul walking deep into Athens' city streets. Francis walking deep into the countryside outside of Assisi. Both straying from their familiar routes, looking attentively at what they saw. Listening now more than talking. Noticing more than judging. Being mindful is what we would call it today. Looking all around where they already were with curiosity and with openness. And looking in this way, they found beauty and truth that had been there all along. Paul found beauty and truth on a Greek altar he might have sneered at before, and in the poetry of a pagan. Francis, whose family wealth came from trading luxurious fabrics, found beauty in a worm and a sparrow, nature's lush bounties present everywhere. Both Paul and Francis gave dignity to what their old religions would have rejected. They focused on what unifies us all across divisions. Paul dignified the Athenians' yearning for the unknown God, quote, in whom we live and move and have our being, that they worshiped at an altar. Paul recognized that yearning is shared by all of humanity the world over. And Francis, he dignified all living creatures, naming the stars and animals and birds his sisters and brothers, our shared connection as all God's creatures. After failing to build anything of meaning when they stayed inside their traditional religious ways of thinking, that idols are evil or the church is a building, both Paul and Francis walked and observed and discovered the holy right where they were already, in Athens, on the altar, in Assisi, and dwelling in the grass and a common sparrow. Churches and Christians were at the same crossroads now as they were in Paul's day or Francis's day. The church could easily have fizzled out at both of those times. For Paul, if he couldn't find a way to connect with a larger group of people, for Francis, out of sheer bombastic weight of a system more intent on destroying any who disagreed, more than on caring first for those in need. And isn't it the same today? Religion becoming less and less attractive as it becomes less and less authentic, read by many as tending toward the vicious and absolute more than towards the simple and caring. Religion, or its purported surrogates, are shouting, kill the infidels, ban the Muslims, no shame in swastikas. Gays and transgender people can be denigrated. Richard Rohr, a Franciscan friar, says that when he was trained in the tradition of Francis in the 1950s, Franciscans never went outside. They had reverted back to their libraries and their chapels again, to their pulpits and their pews, with no renewing attention to nature. He's pushed boundaries about that, and he put up a fuss, hoping his order can again see the unity in all that we share as part of God's creation. And his greatest resistance, his most cruel comments have come from within the church, most often from other ordained people. You see, religious folks everywhere can be the most narrow-minded, denying that we've even lost our way, refusing to entertain new thoughts, certainly not feeling the need to learn from those we intend to convert to our own ways. All of us humans tend to stay where we're most comfortable, and there's a sad truth in how infrequently we may get outside our own walls, listening instead of talking, noticing what we overlooked before, recognizing in the ordinary or the other so much evidence of the holy, our world imbued with the divine right now. Remember, it was out of failure, out of Paul and Francis's getting it wrong at first, that their need developed, their need to take a new, broader, more humble look about them, walking the streets of Athens and walking the country paths outside Assisi. Out of religion's failure today, we also need to get out. This week's newspaper documented that car emissions spill out onto a Chinatown playground right there at the intersection of the Mass Turnpike and Interstate 93. It's high pollution. My driving past that intersection all the time blows into the lungs of somebody else's grandchild playing outside at the Wong playground. To solve the problem, health officials are thinking of moving the new playground about to be built inside. My actions and those children's suffering interconnected. Antarctica's ice sheet may be melting at the South Pole. The New York Times talked about it this week, and it could force everyone in coastal cities to relocate at massive expense, not just in nearby Santiago and Cape Town, but in Boston and in London, a hemisphere away. All of us live and move and have our being within the same interconnected oceans, under the same sky and sun and ozone. We've made mistakes, all of us, and we can either double down, refusing any other way of living or thinking, being right or just or true or beautiful. Or we can walk outside of ourselves and our old ways and notice the divine in all and around all, and loving that we can treasure it. What would we find walking Boston city streets, including all those neighborhoods we don't know? Let's do it this summer. As you hike the blue hills of Dorchester and swim in the South Boston Ocean, as you view the glittering skyline from East Boston or Chelsea, and read those best-selling novels by Toni Morrison or Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Think of Paul and Francis and do it. For what was the view of Boston from the Roxbury Mosque that you visited with others from this church, listening quietly to Syrian or Somali hosts? If you couldn't go 2 weeks ago when we went, go this summer, or ask and read in our Between Sundays newsletter the reflections of those who did. Think of Paul and think of Francis. What did you see and smell and hear in the Mother's Day March for Peace last Sunday as you looked closely at the neighborhoods you passed through, listened closely to the myriad different accents, and saw the children's faces up on posters, those who had died? If you couldn't go this year, visit the Lewis Brown Peace Center with Carol Genovese this summer, or read her reflections in our newsletter this week. What did you notice in yourself and others during the shared reflections about what our skin colors connote on our Boston city streets? If you couldn't be at the book discussion where this took place last Wednesday, maybe you can be at the next two, or read the book on your own. And this week, as the sunshine popped out and you toured the gardens on Beacon Hill, or walked through the public garden, or tended your own windowsill pot of herbs, as you scratched behind your doggy's ears or your cat nestled against you in these nearby local spaces, in your furry friend, did you also find the holy and the dignity of all life? If you didn't, there is still time. There was another chance for Paul and Francis. And because they took it, it made all the difference. It's why the church survived and then thrived. It's what I meant at the beginning by saying that these two initial huge flops that Paul and Francis had may have let us all be here today. They learned a new way and church carried on. When we move out beyond our stone chapels and beyond the audience where our credentials and vocabulary are understood like Paul, well, then there's hope for us and for what Jesus really taught. We escaped the divisive stuff taught by too many churches then and now. We again see our shared humanity with faces and not races. We noticed our shared yearning for an unknown God in whom we live and move and have our being. We share space as creatures in the world on our one precious earth and want to protect the environment. The divine on earth, not in some distant, far heaven. And trout and squirrels and Ethiopians and Italians in us, all of us creatures of our God and King. All of us living within the divine now, the one in whom we move and live and have our being, all interconnected, not separate. As they say in the common Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, and Muslim greeting, Namaste, the divine in me meets the divine in you.